Hey everyone, Mr. DVB here with my first review for a PS5 game, Spider-Man Miles Morales, a sequel and sort of spin-off to the 2018 game Marvel's Spider-Man developed by Insomniac Games. As someone who loves the 2018 game, I was incredibly excited to experience another chapter in this series, especially one focused on Miles Morales, who was in the first game but without any of his own spider powers. When the game was first announced, I was a bit worried that it would feel like the DLCs for the first game, which I largely found to be dull and uninspired. But once we saw that footage of Rhino in the mall, I knew I could lay my worries to rest. Miles Morales is definitely a shorter title than the first, taking me only 6 to 7 hours to complete the main storyline. This may be problematic for some, but the reduced price point of the game helps. Miles Morales takes place roughly a year after the events of the previous game. Miles is now Peter's sidekick, helping him take on crime throughout the city. After a fantastic encounter with Rhino, where Miles discovers his new Venom powers in which he can send out surges of electrifying punches, Peter reveals that he is going on a work trip with MJ, and that he feels Miles is ready to protect the city by himself. Of course, things end up going wrong as the Underground shows up, a terrorist group that uses incredibly advanced technology led by the Tinkerer as they take on Roxxon Energy, a shady company led by Simon Krieger. Despite the game's shorter length, Insomniac does a fantastic job at delivering a strong story with memorable characters, great set pieces, and a surprising level of heart and emotion. I really liked the character development for Miles, doubting his actions constantly as he tries his best to protect the city. This is very much a game about Miles becoming his own Spider-Man, and straying away from living under the shadow of his mentor. The side characters joining you in this game include some familiar faces, such as Miles' mother, who is running for mayor, and new ones such as Ganke, Miles' tech genius friend, and Finn, Miles' middle school crush. I enjoy the relationships between all of these characters. There were some great small moments with them that contained a lot of heart, but due to the game's shorter length, these moments were fewer and farther between, or would they be considered farther? From a villain standpoint, the game introduces us to the Tinkerer, the leader of the Underground, who, as I mentioned earlier, wants to take down Roxxon led by Simon Krieger. As the Tinkerer and the Underground lead more attacks, Roxxon steps up their security force and they turn into another group of enemies for you to take on. I really liked the inclusion of all the villains in this game, as they all felt well used in the story, and because of characters like the Prowler, there was a good level of connection between friend and foe. Overall, the storyline is rather simple, similar to the first game, but Insomniac does a great job at telling it through the lens of their very well written and crafted characters. The shorter length of the game does take away a bit from fleshing out relationships as much as I would have liked, but it also makes it so that the game's pacing never slows down, making this a very fast-paced and enjoyable storyline. Gameplay in Miles Morales is very similar to the previous games for the most part. Web-slinging and combat all virtually work the same for the most part, but there are some new additions due to Miles' unique abilities not found with Peter. I loved the variety of Venom powers at Miles' disposal. You charge up the Venom meter by simply dealing damage to enemies. Once a bar is charged up, you can choose between a variety of Venom attacks, or wait to charge all 3 bars up and unleash an incredibly powerful move that will wipe out the majority of enemies surrounding you. If you find yourself taking a lot of hits in combat, you can either heal by pressing down on the D-pad, which does take away from your Venom meter, or use Miles' cloaking ability, turning yourself invisible so you can make a quick getaway, and reapproach the situation. One aspect of gameplay that I would say Miles does better is the inclusion of the boss fights. In the first game, most of the boss fights were pretty generic and just turned out to be pattern recognition. In this game, I felt like they were a lot more involving and I had a lot of fun with them. Miles' playstyle is much more focused on physical attacks than Peter's was, who had a much wider variety of gadgets. Otherwise, the gameplay is virtually the same. One aspect of the 2018 game I found to be pretty lackluster was the side missions. A lot of them felt extremely repetitive and were a chore to get through. Miles features less side missions and activities than the predecessor, but they're mostly the same. You have a lot of generic enemy bases that you must take down, tons of repetitive crimes in the streets, lots of collectibles to find, and a few basic missions like helping a man find his cat, which I have no problem with. There are some side missions that explain some backstory for characters like Miles' father or his uncle, and these ones stood out as they explored Miles' relationships with his family a bit more. I think what Insomniac could work on for side missions in the sequel that both games were lacking is introducing side storylines with new villains, similar to the Arkham games. The first game did have a side story involving Tombstone, but those ended up turning into more enemy bases without any real variety or story to carry it. As it stands, the side quests here were pretty lackluster, similar to the first game. Miles Morales looks and runs beautifully on the PlayStation 5. It takes on average only 8 seconds to go from the main menu and into a side mission using the PS5 card system. On top of that, fast traveling from one side of the map to the other takes about 2 seconds, and those annoying loading screens that would happen once you were done taking down an enemy base are no longer a thing. Now you just go straight out into the city and can go back to exploring. It's truly incredible seeing how fast the PlayStation 5's SSD is, and how they incorporated it into this game was a joy to see. Open world wise, I love the winter setting for the game. Seeing New York City with Christmas lights and snow everywhere made for a really charming experience, and seeing some of the buildings that were under construction in the previous game now complete was fun as well. Insomniac even changed the animations very slightly, so when Miles is in freefall, his arms flail, or when he web dashes onto a pole, he catches himself. Little details like this are fun additions that help hit home the idea of a younger, less experienced Spider-Man. Visually, you can choose between playing the game in native 4K with ray tracing at 30 FPS, or dynamic 4K without ray tracing at 60 FPS. For my playthrough of the story, I chose to play the game in native 4K with 30, as it's truly a sight to behold. Then, after completing the story, I switched over to 60 for the side missions. Either way, the game looks fantastic. With native 4K, you do have the bump in resolutions, which allows for tiny details to stand out more, and the reflections you see in buildings' windows or on the ground are great as well with the inclusion of ray tracing. On the flip side, seeing Spider-Man swing across the city from skyscraper to skyscraper in 60 FPS is incredible. The buttery smooth frame rate helps it feel even more engaging than ever before. Speaking of engagement, the game does a great job at incorporating the PS5's new DualSense controller. The vibrations you feel when using your Venom powers are incredibly intense, and the way the trigger gets tighter as you swing before suddenly releasing when Miles lets go of the web is more immersive than ever before. The last thing I want to touch on for this game is the score. I loved the soundtrack for the 2018 game. The main Spider-Man theme there was epic and is probably my favorite score for the character. Miles' score is fantastic as well, and I may even prefer his main theme over Peter's. The entire soundtrack caters to Miles with its inclusion of beats, and swinging around the city and fighting enemies felt great with the score backing it up. Overall, Spider-Man Miles Morales is a great addition to this series. Its shorter length allows for the game to never slow itself down, and it does a surprisingly great job of delivering a well-told story with good characters and emotion in such a short time. For the reduced price point, I definitely recommend picking this title up.